Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here, and thank you to SANS and the NCSC for running such an excellent event. It's one that I feel like I'm always going to learn so much from, and I hope that you're going to take some stuff away about not just Russia-based threat actors, but about the various different pieces of tradecraft that we need to have in order to be able to track them. When I was thinking about what kind of title to come up with this, I'd read about a thing called service à la Russe, which is food Russian style, which is almost lots of small platters served sequentially. And I think that's a good description for what this talk is, because I'm going to show you a bunch of different case studies into Russia-based threat actors, and not deep dive into any one bit in particular. So if you're not an expert into these threat actors, you don't need to be. Hopefully you can still take away something from this. My name is John Southworth. I've been part of the PwC threat intelligence team for a bit over 8 years now. And while I do things like supporting our incident response teams and helping run our digital risk intelligence practice, my passion is threat actor tracking and technical analysis. I initially started looking at North Korea-based threat actors when I started, moving on to China-based threat actors, and more recently in my career, looking at Russia-based threat actors. And today, I'm going to take you through a few different parts. Don't worry, I'm not going to go too heavy on the food puns. This is basically it. We're going to give a bit of an overview first into the Russia-based threat actor landscape, what that means, the types of motivations of threat actors, and some of the geopolitics that you need to bear in mind going forward as well. We'll then get into the meat of the talk itself, which is going to be some of the case studies into 3 of the Russia-based threat actors that myself and the team have tracked over the last year, and a 4th threat actor, which we suspect is Russia, but can't quite prove it at this stage, but I think it's quite interesting anyway. And then we'll wrap up by talking about what it means to look ahead when it comes to thinking about Russia itself and what we might expect for threat actors in the future. And just to note that there, this is, while I'm going to be presenting stuff from some of my own research, this is definitely a team effort. I have an amazing group of people that I work with at PwC who can build to all this analysis, so I want to make sure that I shout them out as well. But to start with, let's think about what the threat landscape looks like from the Russia-based threat actor perspective and what the various motivations of threat actors are. I think it's always good to give an overview of that, right? And from the PwC perspective, we have kind of 4 main categories for how we look at threat actors. Espionage, so stealing information for the purposes of political, economic, or maybe intelligence gathering advantage. Cybercriminals that will be doing campaigns for the purposes of trying to monetize access to organizations. Hacktivists that will be targeting organizations for the purposes of, for a cause that they wish to develop and promote. And then sabotage threat actors, which will be trying to disrupt organizations and in some cases actually have a physical impact. And what's interesting about Russia-based threat actors is that if we look at them, they can actually fit into kind of all of these categories in various different formats. When we think about espionage, this is almost the business as usual activity of threat actors that we think about, where they're going after organizations in the government, defense, NGO sectors to steal information for intelligence gathering purposes. But we also see that there's an overlap with the cybercriminal threat landscape, and there's certain threat actors in the space, such as Blue Dev 11, or better known as Romcom in open source, that originally was known for some of its cybercriminal activities, but eventually started pivoting over to conduct more espionage-like campaigns. So there's a certain overlap there as well. And we can't forget about the hacktivist threat from Russia perspective as well. There are plenty of threat actors out there that will be targeting organizations for the cause of disrupting them just for taking either a pro-Ukrainian or anti-Russian stance. And that can bleed into kind of influence operations that will be run out of either volunteer schemes or threat actors aligning to the Russian state itself. And finally, there are several threat actors that have been known to target organizations deploying things like disk wipers to actually cause physical disruption to systems in Ukraine itself. So we'll be talking a little bit about all of this throughout the talk itself, but to give an overview of what the geopolitical landscape looks like is always a good place to start. I think this talk can complement a lot of what's been discussed already at this conference, specifically around Ukraine and the fact that the ongoing war means that Russia-based threat actors from the start of the conflict were very much tasked of going after a lot of organizations, both for the purposes of disrupting them and for gathering intelligence, and that is going to continue going forward as the conflict continues. And if they can go after key critical sectors to cause that disruption, whether it's in defense, but also as part of the wider supply chain, also affecting organizations that might be bringing goods into the country, that can have a massive impact. But it's not just Ukraine itself. There's a lot of organizations around the world that, or a lot of countries that will be actually sanctioning kind of Russian organizations And that means that Russia-based threat actors are going to see their targets more broadly. So not just from that hacktivist perspective, but also for the targeting of espionage groups, going after Europe and North America more broadly as well. And then finally, when we think about Russia in the modern day itself, it's having to align itself less with the West and more with other countries going forward from a few different either diplomatic or strategic perspectives. I know there's China, North Korea, and Iran as examples for that. And that can actually lead into some military support as well. We've seen those reports about North Korean soldiers being deployed to Ukraine specifically. So while there is that military aspect, it's yet to be fully seen what that will look like from the cyber perspective, but something that we need to consider going forward as well. So let's get into some of the case studies, into some of the various Russia-based threat actors that myself and the team have been tracking over the year. A lot of these threat actors have been around for kind of a long time, and so there will be some that you're familiar with and maybe some that you aren't so familiar with. Try to pick in a good sample set for you. And I want to start with one that we call Blue Python. That's kind of PwC's name for it, but is much better known for its open source name of Turla or Secret Blizzard, which is Microsoft's name. This is a threat actor that has been around for such a long time, and I think when we're having some of the discussions from folks earlier yesterday around the fact that Russia-based threat actors have been active since the late 90s, this is one of them. There's probably people in the room here today who aren't as old as this threat actor, which is a slightly scary thought, but this is a threat actor that will target a variety of sectors. There's more than what's on the screen there, but if we think of some of the key ones, like government, defense, education, NGOs, think tanks, and also the pharmaceutical sector, especially when it was coming to things like the research into the COVID vaccine. So quite a broad set of sector targets, and has had quite a lot of research done this year in open source. So we have some stuff from Microsoft at the top right there, so campaigns that were observed by the threat actor conducting adversary in the middle campaigns against diplomats within Russia itself, using quite a scary capability of being able to do kind of local intercept on their communications to insert like malware loading pages in between. Very interesting blog, and highly recommend checking that out. And then another one there from ESET, which was talking about Turla and another Russia-based threat actor, which is called Gamradon Group, and the kind of collaborations between these groups, where Gamradon was able to actually help Turla deploy some of its malware, and in particular helped it deploy a thing called the Kazuya backdoor. This is one that I wasn't massively familiar with before I started looking at it earlier in the year, and thought this is a good opportunity to try and find new information about it and see what I can learn anyway. And an important piece of Tradecraft that we need to take away from the first point is that we have to do all this reading around as threat intelligence analysts. There's so much good research out there that's put out by many different vendors, many of whom are in the crowd today and who have done talks at this conference as well. And one of the starting points I looked at was Palo Alto's blogs into the Kazuya backdoor that's been used by Turla. I'm not going to go into too much detail on how the backdoor itself works, because they've done a really good explanation of how it is. Sometimes a backdoor is just a backdoor. It gives the threat actor persistent access to a system. So can highly recommend that. That's one that you can actually go and start doing a bunch of your own investigations from itself. What can you learn from what they've presented? Can we write Yara rules based off of this? Can we look for those bits of infrastructure that they've highlighted? And I did some research earlier in the year and actually slipped up a little bit myself, because that other blog on the screen there by Lab52 actually covers a lot of the things that I also found. So while it's nice to see some independent research coming to the same conclusion, sometimes reading around is going to be really helpful. And if you want to learn more about the loaders I'm going to be able to be discussing, that blog is very good too. So Kazuya itself has been active for a while, but if we think about what the 2024 targeting looks like, based on the fact that if you get a copy of these samples, they usually are hard coding either a computer name or a DNS-derived domain of the target that they want to go after in the sample itself, kind of as a form of guardrails. It can give some information into the victimology as well. And in the samples that I was able to observe, they had gone after a few different kinds of organizations, so predominantly military organizations within Ukraine itself, and then government departments throughout Europe. And from the ones that we could see and decipher at least, those are falling into a few different categories of ministries, so like a Ministry of Finance, a Ministry of Technology, and a Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So kind of well-known targeting of Turla over the years itself. To actually get to that insight, finding the backdoors is something that can be very useful, because if we can get a copy of that, we can analyze a piece of malware, we can look at its infrastructure and understand it. But a lot of these times, backdoors aren't going to be hitting disk. They're going to be something that's loaded into memory and potentially only be present in memory by a previous stage that will decrypt it. So personally, if I'm doing this investigation, I'm going to be trying to write YARA rules and do threat hunting specifically for the loaders of these samples, because if you can get copies of those, you can get the backdoors as well, usually. So in this case, I was able to find a bunch of these loaders and go and analyze them, but kind of hit a brick wall initially where the threat actor was using a crypto routine, which you can see on the right-hand side, to decrypt the next stage. This cryptography routine itself was using an initialization value, again, of what I was just describing, the computer name of or the DNS-derived domain of the system that it had infected. So if that name is right, the cryptography works, it decrypts the next stage, and great, I can go look at the back door. But if it doesn't work, it doesn't decrypt the next stage, the sample will stop running because it has failed, and it makes my life a lot easier, because a lot more difficult, rather, because then I'm not going to be able to look at the payload itself. So if I don't know that computer name, how do I decrypt the next stage? Well, similarly to what Adrian was describing yesterday when he was trying to decrypt firmware, the threat actor reuses that cryptography routine in a different part as well, where on the bottom left-hand side, you can see a bunch of the export names of the loader itself. Those export names are used at different points in the loader to pass execution to different stages of it, and it uses the exact same cryptography routine. So, hey, I have encrypted data and I have known plaintext data. By doing some operations on that, I can effectively get out the initialization that's needed to do the rest of the cryptography and decode the next stages as well. So kind of an advice for the threat actor of don't necessarily reuse that cryptography in that way, and in a lot of ways, don't roll your own crypto. That's, I think, good standard advice for them. Now, a lot of these loaders were in plain text and actually had some nice debug messages throughout, so you could actually go and read how it works. And again, we've got on the left-hand side that cryptography routine itself. You don't need to be an IDA Pro expert to understand it. It's just this is fairly easy to read. There's no obfuscation. But the one on the right is another copy of one of the loaders from a little bit later on. And in this case, there's a lot of junk code that they've inserted into the payload itself. So fortunately, the decryption routine isn't too obfuscated, and you can actually see by comparing the two samples that they're roughly the same thing. So when you're going to do anything like writing YARA rules for the various different samples that you want to track, always try to build some redundancy in. Do things like looking at strings, but also try and get every code routine out that you can that's going to let you track it and go forward itself. And then finally, when it comes to Kazuo itself, it's useful to have a little bit of a capability to do some automation. There's a bunch of encoded strings using that subroutine you can see on the screen there. Rather than having to go and load this into memory and see these all be decrypted, it's sometimes worth just writing an IDA Python script to go and do that for you. And those strings that you can see down there that I've highlighted are for the next stage loading of the Kazuo backdoor or other samples itself. I found some other loaders that were a little bit later on, or earlier in this year rather, that don't seem to exactly be loading Kazuo, but something else. So there's more investigation to be done there. If you can find a copy of these loaders, then you're going to find not just Kazuo, but potentially other samples as well. So moving away from Turla and to another threat actor that you've probably all heard of. We call them Blue Echidna, but they're better known in open source as Sandworm, APT44, Iridium, so on. This is one that, when we think about sabotage threat actors, has been very well known for previously targeting things like ICS devices in Ukraine and actually having that physical impact. And so you might think, if you're thinking about Sandworm, that this is a threat actor that really you should only care about if you're a Ukrainian organization, but that's not a correct stance to take. This research that was produced by Microsoft earlier this year on what they called bad pilots was a campaign that was being used for kind of initial access via Sandworm itself. And this threat actor had such a broad geographical targeting that it almost looked fairly global from the different kinds of initial access it was providing to the threat actor itself. So we have to bear that in mind, even though the sabotage campaigns that have been observed from Sandworm are predominantly affecting Ukraine, the initial access operations are much broader. There's also been some reporting earlier in the year by Eclectic IQ on a backdoor that they called Calumber, which I think comes from something that was derived in the malware itself, being loaded by another loader called backorder. So here's this same thing again. If you can track the loaders, you can make some good progress. And I'm going to show what that looks like in principle. So earlier in the year, there was some various bits of infrastructure reported, I believe in public by ESET as well, talking about some spoofing of their product to install next stage payloads by Blue Echidna. The threat actor can rely on the fact that actually in Ukraine itself, a lot of software that is downloaded is potentially going to be pirated to kind of bypass the fact that you need to pay for the software in the first place. So if you can Trojanize bits of those software, then that's a good initial access method for the threat actor itself. So they're spoofing ESET and those top bars there, looking like you actually need to download a copy of the software. And then it will even load up this application on the bottom right, when in reality, it's beaconing to the infrastructure you can see on screen that is all spoofing ESET in different ways, like ESET Premium, ESET Scanner, ESET Remover, and so on. Now, when we are looking around infrastructure patterns to try and find more of those domains based on that ESET infrastructure, sometimes you have to take a step back. Obviously, we could go and look for subdomains or domains that contain things like ESET in them, but we were looking for more of the patterns that are being used. So those domains were registered through onion mail addresses, so looking for those, and combining that with the fact that a lot of them resolving to or being registered through Cloudflare itself. So we found some more files that way that were actually serving ISO files, and again, very similarly to what I've just described, we're loading a pirated version of Windows as an installer, and this dropped the backorder loader, which is what I've just mentioned before as well. But in this case, it wasn't downloading Calumber, which is the one that's been reported in open source. It was going to GitHub attachments, which I hadn't seen Sandworm using before, to download from that attachment another payload itself, which was which is a Golang payload that we referred to as Tamba, because again, the threat actor has named it that based on some internal strings. That certificate that you can see on the right-hand side is the one that we dropped the disk alongside it, and was called something like tamba.crt. This is a work in progress tool, we think, because while it does do some activity to set up SSH and RDP connections for the threat actor to later log into the system that it's infected, there are references to things like Tor being used as well in the sample itself, even though it didn't implement it. So we expect that either this is a work in progress or we're going to see more of this in the future. But those are a couple of highlights from some of the key threat actors. You've probably heard of both of those ones from various bits of open source research or the fact that they've been around for so long. But let's go a little bit more niche. One that's called Blue Dev 17 on our side, or has been reported earlier in the year as Void Blizzard by Microsoft, after there was disclosure by various Dutch intel agencies into the threat actor, which they also called Laundry Bear. This is a threat actor that has not been around as long as the other ones. In fact, it's been assessed to have been active since early 2024. And again, I'm highlighting this a few times. There is a reason for this you'll see later. Targets things like defense, education, governments, NGOs, and so on. So again, some of the same sectors that we've heard of just in the past. This is a threat actor that spoofs a lot of different organizations' events to target individuals who might be attending those organizations. So from the early on reporting, there was a lot of talk around things like defense summits being spoofed for particular individuals who might attend those. As the year went on, they started spoofing NATO events that happened later in the year, other security conferences. In a little bit of a different one, we also saw an agriculture conference being spoofed, which we're not exactly sure which one that was for, because it was just agriculture-forum.org, but we suspect might be the World Agriculture Forum, as that was happening around the same time. And then later in the year again, there were some domains that were spoofing kind of fake news websites, or at least misleading news that was being released to talk about things like the meetings between Trump and Putin that were going on at the time, but also potentially used to serve either credential phishing pages or malware. We're not too sure in that case. And as the year has gone on as well, more NATO spoofing a couple months ago, another security conference, and probably we're going to see more of that into the future from this threat actor as well. And looking at all the different targets from there, we get a good idea that this is mostly going to be defense, but actually there are some more niche conferences that go alongside it that they're spoofing as well for their infrastructure. Now, as much as it is useful to talk about all of the success we have in the pivoting and tracking of threat actors, I think it's also important to talk about mistakes as well. This is going to be an important part when it comes to Tradecraft, to think about this in a few different ways. So when I looked at this initially, I think this is an important threat actor that I want to track to help our customers better understand it. And I found this HTML response that was being returned by one of the domains in Microsoft's blog. And I thought, great, this actually looks fairly unique. At the time of writing, there were about 4 different domains. that were responding to this. There's a few more now, and actually BlueDev 17 is still using this unique response, so it is a good indicator. And in my thought, I looked at these and said, well, there's a couple of actually ones that are spoofing Microsoft, but that last one in particular, weblog mail, actually leads to a new cluster of activity. It's resolving to IP addresses that are within this ASN, which is assigned to GhostNet. And I thought, let's go pivot on this. Let's see what other domains I can go and find. And in doing that, by looking for those patterns, just like I described with Sandworm as well, looking for things like the mail and name server being Namecheap and the fact that it's being hosted by Namecheap as well, or in some cases resolving to this specific ASN, a bunch of infrastructure drops out that has a few different features. Number one, it's spoofing different login applications, particularly for Microsoft products. So this, again, could be some credential spoofing or credential phishing for targets. And that diagram on the right shows the activity of when these domains are being registered or active. And you can see that it's mostly in 2025, but actually goes and lines quite nicely with the beginning of 2024 itself. And I thought, oh, that's perfect. That aligns really nicely with Microsoft's point that it was active since early 2024. This must be the same threat actor. And unfortunately, it wasn't. I can't go into too many details of exactly why that is, but we were able to pivot back into this cluster from looking at another threat actor, which was an Egypt-based threat actor that we call Indigo Dev 1, and have much better confidence that it actually is that threat actor instead. And the problem that really happened here is twofold. Number one, when it comes to infrastructure pivots, you just have to be really careful, right? There's a lot of things that I wanted to make it look like it was this threat actor, but actually didn't quite fit the patterns of the original infrastructure had been tracked as well. And there's a lot of confirmation bias in that, in my point as well. I wanted to try and find a Russia-based threat actor. I was trying to look for it and was a little bit too blasé in actually calling this the same threat actor. But that's why we have to be careful when we do our assessments. That's why we use things like estimative language as well to say, this is likely this threat actor instead. We always have the language that can be associated with the fact that we may make mistakes. And the more time that goes on, the more likely that is going to happen. And we can learn from them. So hopefully you can learn something from this too to understand where to go wrong. And then this final threat actor that I want to talk about, this is one that I hopefully learned from my mistakes a little bit more. So we call this WhiteDev229, unattributed. Don't know if it is Russia or not, but I'm going to make the case for potentially it being a Russia-based threat actor. It has mainly been targeting NGOs and academics. In particular, we've seen targeting in the UK and Australia itself. And in one of these cases, we saw a phishing email coming from a compromised email account of another organization targeting an individual who was specifically conducting research into Russia itself. They're a member of a European NGO. When we pivoted around as well, we also found other individuals or academics that were doing wider research into Russia, defense, and things like NATO as well. So this is all giving the feeling that this could be somebody who's just interested in defense and Russia at the same time. The threat actor uses Cloudflare workers for its campaigns, and when we looked at one of the bits of infrastructure associated with this, it kind of looks a bit like this. Now, the challenge with Cloudflare workers is that this is third-party shared infrastructure. It's not inherently malicious if you see a Cloudflare worker in your environment. But in this case, they were spoofing OneDrive pages of the organization that they were trying to spoof. So either an organization they've compromised or an organization they want to be seeming as. And it looks like it's a drive linked to a Word document that, again, is going to be associated with the person who is being targeted in themselves. This is actually served up as a legitimate, benign Word document. There's no macros or anything that we could see. It's more just to give the air that something suspicious has happened, while the threat actor is social engineering and saying, let's set up a call and get on that call, even if they don't appear later on. So by looking for that pattern, looking for the fact that we can have Cloudflare workers that are spoofing OneDrive, and then picking things out in the time frame that look like they're spoofing organizations, we can find more WhiteDev229 infrastructure that, again, this is why I was highlighting a lot of it earlier, is spoofing government, education, defense, and then a little bit of a weird one, mining as well. So again, we have to be careful with the language we use here, because I can't necessarily prove that this is a Russia-based threat actor. I don't have all of the technical evidence to tie it into any known threat groups at this stage, but all of the kind of targeting around it and the tactics that are being used, and the fact that it was probably being used either to do some form of credential spear phishing, or as stuff that's been reported on by Velexity earlier in the year, this like device code authentication phishing, even though I couldn't quite see it at that stage. This could be a Russia-based threat actor as well. But but I'm not going to attribute it. We don't always have to attribute it at this stage. Just talking about it is going to be the interesting part. So as we wrap up, I wanted to first of all highlight some of the threat actors that we've not talked about. You've heard probably of quite a few different Russia-based threat actors that are popular, including things like APT28 or APT29 or Callisto Group. I think even saw there's a blog that's gone out on Callisto Group this morning. So there's always going to be more Russia-based threat actor research into some of the core intrusion sets, but in reality, there's some more niche ones as well. Like I mentioned Romcom earlier on as well. Got Blue Otso, got Invisimol. There's a whole lot that my team has published on throughout the year that I just don't have time to talk about today. So the Russia-based threat actor landscape is very active and with a large variety of threat actors. When we think about what the future looks like for Russia-based threat actors, even though I've talked about some malware today, the amount of malware in general feels like it's going down, and we're having to rely more on infrastructure tracking to try and understand these threat actors. So we need to prioritize that when it comes to our tracking efforts. And on top of what I've just mentioned there about things like the device code authentication phishing or general abuse of legitimate workflows in things like Microsoft or Google platforms, this is something that Russia-based threat actors are innovating on and getting very good at. And so we need to be able to track that more, and that has a very frustrating aspect that there's no malware involved, and there's sometimes not even that much infrastructure involved, because it may all be done via something like email or WhatsApp. So we have to be looking at that into the future as well. And when we think about the fact that the conflict in Ukraine is hopefully going to come to a close soon, it's really hard to tell exactly when it's happening, and it's actually quite exhausting to follow all of the news that goes along with it, but it will draw to a close eventually. And when that happens, the different Russia-based threat actors that are currently targeting Ukraine will potentially have their targeting remit shifted as their intel requirements do. So there may be a lot of threat actors that have spun up only just to target Ukraine, suddenly targeting organizations that will be outside of the country, and we need to be ready to anticipate that as well. And then finally, because something that always needs to be talked about is AI and cloud. Russia-based threat actors have been good at targeting cloud in the past. We can expect that going forward. And they're going to be experimenting with AI. You know, we saw in the talk yesterday about referencing LameHug and the fact that those threat actors are going to be using those services to generate malware on the fly, or to use them to help with things like their influence operations. That's something I think we have to just expect going forward is going to be happening. Realize that we're a little bit over and just in time for lunch, hopefully. But if you've got any questions, feel free to come see me in the break. And otherwise, thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. You covered an amazing amount of ground. I'll just ask one quick question. Attribution getting harder. What would you say to a skeptic about the most robust part of your methodology? So if someone was saying, look, how can you be really sure? What's the bit about this suite of attribution that you feel this is really strong?
Yeah, well, I think it's one of those things where we have to look at it from so many different aspects, right? You know, I think somebody mentioned in a talk earlier the diamond model of let's make sure we have a few different points that we can work with. So whether that's a capability, a piece of malware that we've associated with the threat actor before, or its infrastructure, and try to build up that picture. If obviously we can tie it back into known threat actor activity, that's great, because we'll have other people independently saying the same things about this being Russia. But obviously we want to look at things like the motivations of the campaign itself. But like I highlighted, we don't always need to attribute. If we can get a good enough one, then that's sometimes going to work. But we can't always get to the end goal, and that's part of the challenge of our job as well, is to try and be accurate as best as possible.
Brilliant. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you very much.